This revolver is a gem, one of the earliest models of Smith & Wesson revolver. Its offspring include models like the Victory and the Model 10, and well, most every other Smith & Wesson revolver. Hi, I'm Jim Humphrey with Imminent Threat Defense Firearms Training. This design is so robust, as you'll see in a minute. It looks virtually identical to Smith & Wesson revolvers made today. I'm really excited to bring it to you. Let's have a look inside.
As always, before working on any firearm, carefully check to ensure it's unloaded and remove all live ammo from the work area. I remove the stocks by pulling straight away from the frame, as there is an aligning hole and stud. The side plate is held by 4 screws. There is one flat-headed screw, and these 2 lower crown-headed screws, and a larger crown-headed screw at the top. The 4 screws are all different, so I'm careful to keep them organized. Note that these 2 lower crown-headed screws look identical. In fact, they are actually the same part number. However, the front screw has been factory fitted to properly retain the yoke, and it takes a micrometer to see the difference. The top screw is the shortest. There's only one of these flat-headed screws, and then there are the 2 bottom crown-headed screws, and I'll be sure to keep that front one separate. To remove the side plate, I give the frame a few taps with a plastic hammer, which loosens the plate. The hammer block just rests on top of the other parts, so it often falls out with the side plate. I'll remove it and set it aside. With the front screw removed, the yoke and cylinder will slide out. I'll set those aside for later. I'll disengage the hammer from the mainspring. The mainspring is retained by the strain screw. Note that this screw is a little larger than the other screws, so it will require a larger driver. With the strain screw loose, the mainspring will fall free. I found the easiest way to remove and install the rebound slide is with a special tool. I fabricated this one out of a piece of 3/16" brass rod, but you can find them online. I'm very cautious of the rebound slide spring, as it's very powerful and it's easy to launch across the room. I keep it covered until it releases. To remove the trigger, pull back the hand and lift straight up on the trigger. To remove the hammer, I push back on the bolt and lift the hammer straight up. I'll leave the stirrup, sear, and firing pin attached to the hammer. While the stirrup and sear are attached to the hammer by pins, the firing pin is riveted. To remove the cylinder stop, I remove the spring behind this retaining screw. The last piece in the frame is the bolt, which is retained by the thumb piece nut on the left side of the revolver. So I'll remove the nut and the thumb piece, again using the correct size driver for the nut. The bolt is held in place by the spring-loaded bolt plunger. To remove the bolt, I push it to the rear, compressing the plunger, and lift up on the front of the bolt. I'm being careful to release the pressure on the plunger before lifting the bolt out. Note the plunger and spring are very small parts. The extracting rod locking bolt is retained by a very tight fitting pin, so for this project we'll leave it alone as there's some potential for scratching the finish. Let's have a look at the trigger group. The trigger lever and hand can be removed. The hand is retained by a spring-loaded lever and can be simply lifted off. The spring and lever are inside the trigger and retained by a pin. The hand has two pins in the back. The longer pin is the hinge pin, and the shorter pin is a spring retainer. The lever must be pushed back far enough to get the short pin behind the lever. When the hand is properly installed, the spring-loaded lever will hold it in position. Now we can have a look at the yoke and cylinder. The yoke should easily slide off the extractor rod. In order to disassemble the rest of the cylinder, I have to unthread the extractor rod. I need to protect the rod with a piece of leather or use padded pliers to remove it. In this case, the rod is too tight for my pliers, so I'll use this special clamp. This tool is homemade. It's also made from aluminum, so it won't scratch the rod. But similar tools can be found at Brownells or Midway USA. If the rod is very tight, it's a good idea to put some dummy rounds or empty cases in the cylinder to support the extractor. Some extractor rods are left-hand thread and some are right-hand thread. Obviously, it pays to do your homework. The extractor rod for this generation Smith & Wesson is attached with a right-hand thread. The extractor rod is spring-loaded. It's a very light spring, but I keep a little pressure on it as it unscrews. With the extractor rod removed, the remainder of the pieces can be just pulled apart. The extractor rod collar will probably come off with the rod, so notice its orientation. Also note, the center pin has a small spring. The larger extractor spring is fairly thin, so I remove it carefully. Now the extractor can be removed from the other end of the cylinder. The assembly of the cylinder is the reverse process. Note that the extractor stem is grooved. This groove must be aligned with a notch in the cylinder. Align the groove with the notch and slide the extractor into the cylinder. Now, from the other end of the cylinder, insert the extractor spring and the center pin and the center pin spring. Place the extractor rod collar on the extractor rod so the collar will fit inside the extractor spring. Thread on the extractor rod. Using the extractor rod tool, I firmly tighten the extractor rod. I add a few drops of oil to the yoke and extractor rod before I insert the yoke, and I'll set the yoke and cylinder aside while I assemble the frame. Next, I'll assemble the frame. First, I check to make sure I have all the parts, in particular, that small bolt plunger and spring. I start the frame assembly with the bolt. I insert the plunger end of the bolt into the slot, push back on the bolt so that I can press the plunger, and then drop the bolt into place. Then, attach the thumb piece and secure it to the bolt with the thumb piece nut. Next, I insert the cylinder stop, its spring, and retaining screw. To install the hammer, the bolt must be held back. During install, the firing pin will barely clear the frame. To install the trigger, I push the trigger lever up so it stays inside the frame. I pull the hand back, line the trigger up with the cylinder stop, and drop the trigger straight down on the trigger stud. Once the trigger is in place, I give the hand a nudge so that it fits in the hand slot. The trigger lever must be accessible to the hole in the end of the rebound slide, and I push the stirrup up out of the way. The rebound slide is installed by placing the front of the slide against the trigger lever. The rebound slide is at a bit of an angle when I compress the rebound slide spring and drop the back of the slide down so the spring is retained by the stud. I use a lot of caution here. This is a powerful spring. This is where this specialty tool really comes in handy. The mainspring is installed by engaging the top hooks of the spring into the stirrup and the bottom of the spring in the slot in the frame. The spring is retained by the strain screw. I make sure to fasten this screw snugly. I check that the bottom of the spring is centered on the frame and the top is properly engaged in the stirrup. I take this opportunity to lubricate the studs and the wear points. The hammer block fits loosely over the stud on the rebound slide, and I push the hammer block up to the top of its travel. To install the side plate, the slot on the back of the slide plate must line up with the hammer block. The slide plate should fit with very little force. A few light taps of the plastic hammer should be all it takes to get a smooth fit. The short crown-headed screw goes in the top of the plate. The flat-headed screw will be under the grip panel. Then I make sure I have the two lower crown-headed screws correctly identified, and now I install the correct screw in the middle position. I install the yoke and cylinder assembly, being cautious not to force it to fit. This assembly should install easily. The front crown-headed plate screw can now be installed. This screw will retain the yoke and cylinder. I give it a function test to make sure the action moves smoothly and properly. The final step is to install the stocks, pressing them straight on while aligning the stud in the butt of the frame with the holes in the stocks. Now, firmly install the stock screw. I'm careful not to over-tighten the stock screw. The escutcheon nut on the right-hand side of the stock is just pressed into the wood. I don't want to spin it loose.
I'm Jim Humphrey with Imminent Threat Defense Firearms Training. And until next time, enjoy your firearms, join the NRA, and be safe out there. Thanks.